Senate debate forum. We thought we were going to have more candidates than this, but we had only one candidate, Phoebe Holmes, from the 107th district, and she decided it would be much easier if we let Eva and Steve do the talking rather than confuse people, as this is getting streamed and all over on the public access network. So thank you again to our two candidates, Eva Bermudez Zimmerman and Stephen Harding. I understand there is a baseball game on tonight. Being a Red Sox fan, my season was over a long time ago. So without further ado, we have Scott Benjamin as our moderator tonight again, and we appreciate your time, Scott, to do this. And I don't think there's any audience participation tonight. That is correct. So please, everybody, let's be respectful. Don't forget to turn your cell phones off or put them on vibrate so that we don't get a buzzing in the recording as we go through this tonight. Thank you very much.
Our format: 2 minutes opening statements, round of questions, 2 minutes for a response, 1 minute for rebuttal, closing statements 4 minutes. First opening statement, Mr. Harding.
Thank you, Scott, and I want to thank you for sharing the microphone tonight. I also want to thank you for doing the forum. I want to thank the Chamber, as always, to Linda, to Rich, to Marie, to Jackie Salem, for everybody for putting on this event every single year. And it's a great opportunity for the voters to hear from all of us. It's an honor to be here tonight. It's great to be here with my opponent. Thanks for coming, Eva. And just for those who don't know who I am, my name is Stephen Harding. I am the state representative currently of the 107th District, which is my hometown of Brookfield, and a piece of Bethel and a piece of Danbury as well. I grew up in this town. I went through schools here, K through 12. I sat through many meetings in this auditorium and probably spent less attention than I probably should have. And I was actually a custodian at this school when I was in college and I was in law school. So this community means something to me, particularly my hometown of Brookfield. My wife and Kelly and I are honored to be raising our own family here. My son Carter, who's 4, my daughter Piper, who's 2. My son Carter will be the first class to start the school year at Canoa Lake Elementary School, and I see Colette and other people in the crowd tonight who were instrumental in that, and I really enjoyed working with our local officials to get the state funding to build that project. It was something that was very important to our town. I'm running for the reasons that many of us know about. That's affordability, the tax burden that we place upon the residents of this community, public safety, supporting our law enforcement, allowing them to do the job they do best to protect us, and open space and local zoning protections, making sure that the open space and beauty we have in this community remains local and decided locally by our local officials. So I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and I look forward to a great discussion. Thank you.
Ms. Zimmerman, 2 minutes.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here, and thank you, Marie and the Chamber of Commerce, for putting this together. A very important conversation. The reality that we had when I was a child, my parents are educators, and when I was very young, my mom was a stay-at-home mom, so my dad carried the salary. So that reality where he had 2 cars in the household, we had a wonderful roof on top of our heads in Hartford. I had no quarrels to ask for anything. I had to go, I had the ability to go to summer camp, ability to go to college, and really depend on my parents to really carry that cost. Is not the reality that we have now, unfortunately. Inflation is staggering all the way upward. Our cost for oil, for housing is going up and up and up. A lot of the families that lived here generation after generation are feeling like they're pinching just to make sure that they're keeping for their ends meet, but also making sure that they're paying for college tuition and making sure that they're paying their everyday use. So that reality we really have to tackle when it comes to the state legislature. Oftentimes when I'm at door knocking in my everyday job as a child care advocate, and working really hard with small businesses, people are telling me, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do together? And I tell them, we're going to figure things out, because right now the legislature does have the power to share that burden and make sure that our breathing room is real, that we could stay here in Connecticut and make sure that we can put food on the table and put kids through college. My primary concern with that housing cost and the cost of everything going up is going through healthcare, going through childcare costs. There's not just one cost going up, there's multiple costs going up. So as hopefully future state legislature, that's my goal, talking about and discussing what are we gonna do to make sure our families here can stay here. Thank you.
First question, what will you do to combat inflation? Ms. Zimmerman, 2 minutes.
So in my intro, I alluded to it, but I have an opportunity to tackle it, which is exciting. Inflation. So right now, I'm not a fan of gimmick proposals in the legislature. If we're going to tackle something, tackle it straight head on. So if we're going to do gas tax holidays, if we're going to have opportunities to discuss about a highway tax or a diesel tax, what does that look like in the impact of a small business owner? What does it look like in the impact of the everyday person living here? I would like to really concentrate on big picture items. One way to do that is early childhood, universal childhood education. We have right now a surplus in our revenue, and we can take that money and use it to really mitigate the cost of living here. And I would love to see that. So rather than having a $2 million tax holiday or 10 million there, 5 million there, let's take the billions of dollars and use it as a space for breathing room for Connecticut families. This past year, I helped with Connecticut Childcare for Connecticut's Future, CCFCT, to get $183 million for childcare providers, small business owners, so that they can stay here, that they can keep their businesses here. 30% of the childcare provider workforce has disappeared in the last 2 years because of COVID. Those are the kind of conversations I would like to have, and use the money that we have accessible right now to tackle that. Inflation is hitting us very hard. I would love the opportunity to take Speaker Ritter's the proposal to have a special session and then talk about tax holidays furthermore, and talk about maybe tackling heating costs for our winter. I don't know about you, but I just got my heating bill and it's staggering. So let's talk about how that's going to impact everyone in the state of Connecticut, and that should happen right now.
Mr. Harding, 2 minutes.
Thank you. I wouldn't consider reducing taxes as gimmicks right now. I mean, this is when you're dealing with the inflation that we're dealing with in the state of Connecticut. You're talking about 8.3% inflation. You're talking about the taxes that were going to be implemented starting in January 1. So there's a highway use tax that's supposed to be on the honor system in the state of Connecticut. I don't know how they plan to enforce it, and I haven't heard how they're going to plan to enforce it, but that's supposed to garner about $90 million in revenue, which is a nice way of saying $90 million in new taxes that are going to be baked into all your costs when you go to the grocery store, when you go to the department store to buy your goods and services. All of those goods and services obviously come from trailer, or the far majority do. So when you're talking about reducing about $90 million in taxes, that are not going to be baked into your cost. It seems like a small amount of money, but that adds up. Even you did allude to it, and you're exactly right, that when you're talking about heating oil and all the pressing costs that you're going to be facing, small things like that, like reducing a $90 million tax that can get passed down to the consumer, is critically important. I think we also want to talk about the 25-cent tax that's been reduced on our gas. That's supposed to sunset in December, conveniently after the election. I would hope that that's going to continue to be sunsetted, and that 25-cent reduction would continue to be passed down to the consumer as well. So I'm looking at more ways to alleviate the tax burden on people in the state. If you speak to many individuals, and unfortunately I've seen a lot of individuals, my parents' age, my friends of parents, leave this community because they can't live here based upon the tax burden. So anything that we can do to help tackle that tax burden, particularly when we're facing 8.3% inflation throughout this country and the state, is something that I would absolutely support.
Ms. Zimmerman, 1 minute.
Just to clarify how that gas tax impacted here in Connecticut, the everyday user, Many of the gasoline station owners didn't have the opportunity or didn't take the opportunity to relieve that 25 cents gas tax. Instead, they pocketed that money. So when I'm talking about legislation that really works for everyone, and it not just works for a few business owners, but every business owner as well as the everyday user, then I'm talking about making clarity in that legislation, making sure that rather than have some tax relief that surmounts $10, $20 million, which in the big picture is a drop in the bucket, we can use that money for something like universal child care and keeping other business owners alive.
Mr. Harding, 1 minute.
So I agree. At the beginning, we were seeing some owners who gas owners were not passing down that cost. It's just reprehensible to think at a time like this, businesses are doing that. But I believe the Attorney General was going to enforce that and ensure that individuals or business owners would make sure that those costs were passed down. I think we've seen, fortunately, those costs passed down for the most part. But I agree with you. Any owner or a gas owner in a time like this that we're not passing down this cost should face penalties from the Attorney General's office, because the clear intention from everybody on both sides of the aisle was for a reduction of gas taxes of 25 cents and for consumers to see that reduction. But one thing that would absolutely get baked into your cost is going to be the highway usage tax. So if there's any question about the 25-cent tax being passed down to the consumer, or the relief on that tax to be passed down to the consumer, unfortunately, one thing that you can count on is that the businesses are absolutely going to bake the $90 million in new taxes on the highway use taxes onto your goods and items here in Connecticut. And that's something we have to stop.
What would you do to acquire funds to expand the police headquarters in Brookfield and provide new library facilities? Mr. Harding, 2 minutes.
Well, I think that's something that's important. I think first we have to have a referendum before that gets approved. I would fully support that referendum. I think that one thing that we've heard is that the police station locally doesn't even have the equipment or the ability to have female locker rooms for the female officers. So I mean, I don't think we're even in compliance with federal law. So that has to be repaired, it has to be renovated, it has to be done. I hope the voters of this community support that. I am in full support of allocating the funds to remodel, renovate, or build a new police station, whatever it may come down to. I think it's generally going to be a renovation or a build on along Pocono Road there, where they're going to be building the new police station or the renovated police station. It has to be renovated. Our police officers deserve the resources from the state level. They deserve the resources from the local level as well. One thing that I've always been proud to do is support funding for our local communities. I've always said this, and I'll never apologize for fighting for dollars coming into our local towns over anywhere else. So one thing that I will certainly be willing to do is fight for any state funding that may be available or come available to allocate to the renovation of the new police station. I think that's critically important to our local community, and as I said before, our police officers deserve all our support. It's something that I'm always been proud to stand behind, and I'll always stand behind.
Ms. Zimmerman, 2 minutes.
In addition to supporting the construction funding for a police station here in Brookfield, I would add to that making sure that we have additional funding for unfunded mandates that impact everyone statewide when it comes to police forces. For example, the body cams that they wear, they made a new legislation recently where every single town here in Connecticut has to have them, which is great. A good conversation starter to make sure that everyone's safe on the police officer side, but also the community side. But unfortunately, it doesn't have funding to go behind it. So I'm not a big fan of unfunded mandates. We have to make sure that we dig a little deeper, that when we pass legislation, we're really having a conversation with each town and looking at, can they really take the burden of that cost? Towns like Brookfield that are small towns, we're not Sanford, we're not looking at Hartford or bigger budgets. We really have to be penny pinching when it comes to additional funding, like creating a new police station, like having cameras. And it doesn't even stop at just a body cam. When we're looking at the storage of having those camera footage there and accessible if something does happen, Who's going to pay for the server costs? Who's going to pay for the people monitoring and looking at that video footage and keeping that footage? So those are the kind of conversations that I want to have with our community members, with our chief of police, and making sure that we have additional support systems to take any legislation that comes down our way and really tackle it together.
Mr. Harding, 1 minute.
I would agree. I think that unfunded mandates is a growing problem in our state legislature. It has been a problem for a number of years, and it continues to be a problem in our state. So obviously, finding ways to address unfunded mandates. I mean, one of the things is construction costs are exorbitantly higher based upon unfunded mandates from Hartford. And so I've always stood against those unfunded mandates based upon construction costs. And the cost it places upon municipalities. That's something that I would absolutely support in addressing. And again, we need to provide any funding our police officers need. They have my full support as a candidate. They've had my full support as a state representative.
Ms. Zimmerman, 1 minute.
I guess to add to how we can make sure that public safety is in conversation and everyone's taking it very seriously. Recently, the town of Brookfield also had the conversation of school resource officers, and it'd be great to have additional conversations of what that implementation looks like now that it's passed, and make sure that we're having those conversations and trainings in a very responsible manner with the chief of police and police officers here in the town of Brookfield.
What would you do to address Connecticut's unfunded pension debt? Ms. Zimmerman, 2 minutes.
Well, luckily, the legislature is doing a great job so far. So to use a quick example of anyone who owns a home and paying a mortgage, if you're paying your mortgage regularly and you're on a 30-year term, then you have an expected end date of when you're going to finish off paying that mortgage. Right now, the state of Connecticut, after years and years, over 2 decades of not paying into that debt, it was spiraling. And now we have our fiscal house in order. So with that same methodology of paying a long-term debt, the state of Connecticut is 50% paid off, which is wonderful. In addition to that, the millions of dollars that we're getting in through from just playing in Wall Street, right? That $4 billion surplus that we have accessible to us could be used for other things. So we're paying our fiscal house, we're putting it in order, we have extra money to use for other creative projects to help the community of Connecticut, including Brookfield, which is wonderful. I would like to have the opportunity now that our house is in order, to make sure that our state employees have all support possible in each role in DEP and also Department of Transportation, where we have a lot of infrastructure spending that's happening with the federal government money that's coming in. For example, when I went to DEP and I was doing healthcare conversations as an Access Health assister, I saw cubicles, rows and rows empty from floor 1 to the 5th floor in the DEP building in Hartford. And I would ask them, what's going on? Are people off on, assignments? And they would tell me, the workers there, no, it's attrition. They retired and they haven't been filled. And this past year, there was something called the Silver Tsunami, where thousands and thousands of employees were up against the possibility of retiring, and hundreds of them did retire because their pension benefits were changing. So now we have to have the conversation of how we're going to support and give more resources to our communities through state employees.
Mr. Harding, 2 minutes.
Thank you. I don't know if that Yankee game's going to happen now. I would slightly disagree. I think that we're taking some good steps in terms of where our economy is as a state and where our budget is as a state. But I don't think everything is in order. I think that one of the problems with the last budget that we passed is that we balanced it on the backs of $2 billion in federal funds. So when you start off the next budget year, you're going to have a very big hole that we're going to have to address regarding a deficit in the state of Connecticut. We've also entered in collectively bargained agreements that's going to cost the taxpayers of the state $2 billion over the next 3 years. In addition to that, we're not addressing our pension cost. Connecticut has the second highest debt per capita in the country. That's a problem. That's a real problem. That means that future generations are going to have to pay that. And so what I have been frustrated by in the legislature, and what I'll continue to fight for, is that we have to be better and smarter in terms of how we negotiate our collectively bargained agreements as a state. And we have to look at our long-term obligations. And it comes down to what we can afford. And we should be looking at defined benefit plans, defined contribution plans for new employees. Not employees that are currently in the system, but new employees on day one, to say that we cannot afford the defined benefit plans that we've had for generations here in the state, and we need to move to a defined contribution plan from the state of Connecticut. I just think that we need to be more fiscally responsible when it comes down to collective bargain agreements, which make up a huge aspect of the debt that we have as a state. And as I said, it's second debt per capita, second highest state in regards to debt per capita. So there's more that we need to do structurally, I think, to address the debt in this state. It's not going to be resolved in just one budget.
Ms. Zimmerman, 1 minute.
I think the representative's assertion of tackling the collective bargaining agreement is wishful thinking. I think it's misunderstanding how collective bargaining agreements look and work. As someone who collective bargains with the state of Connecticut, has been doing so for 10 years behind the scenes, I can tell you now that you can't do a reopener without permission. In addition to that, the CBAC agreement just finished, and we have an additional 3 years in that collective bargaining agreement. Unless you're alluding that you're going to be here for another additional term and you're going to win this race, then it's wishful thinking. In addition to that, there are concessions that were made, significant concessions from state employees in the 2015-2016 reopener, and those concessions are still happening today. The COLA and also their pension benefits are lower. The second tier, third tier, and fourth tier, which is the tier that they added, has been reduced significantly in their health insurance and their... Okay, thank you.
Mr. Harding, 1 minute.
So these contracts have been reopened, as you know very well, Eva. They have been reopened not over a span of just on set terms. They've been reopened, and when you're potentially facing a $2 billion deficit, it comes down to what we can afford. And I'm not saying that unions haven't had cuts. They have. You're exactly right. But it comes down to what the taxpayers of the state can afford. And we have to be good stewards and fiscally responsible stewards of the taxpayers' money in this district and across the state. And when collectively bargain, it can't just be based upon what the union wants. It has to be based upon what the taxpayers of this district need and can afford fiscally.
What would you do to improve water quality in the district? Mr. Harding, 2 minutes.
Well, I think we have the Water Sewer Fund and the Clean Water Fund in the state of Connecticut, and I've allocated and worked with DEEP in terms of allocating funds to help offset some of the sewer costs related to the sewers potentially being implemented on Pocono Road. That's a critical issue. For those that are on Pocono Road, as you can see, the septic systems, some of them are failing, and they have a more difficult time based upon how they're adjacent to the Still River. And it also makes the Still River obviously more susceptible, and it makes the septic systems and the water systems at those particular homes susceptible. So even though it's the septic, not necessarily the well, all of it is impacted obviously by the sewer systems and water lines that we have in the state and in this local community. So I have often advocated for utilizing clean water funds to utilize some of those funding and allocate those funds to local areas, particularly towards offsetting some of the costs to implement sewer lines. Pocono Road is one of them. Candlewood Shores obviously is one topic as well, but from what I understand from many of the residents at the shores, that is a issue they want to have more of a voice on, which I totally understand, because obviously the assessment cost involved with putting a newer sewer line is very expensive. And with the inflation that we're facing and the growing costs that we're facing. Is my time up, Linda?
He's got you.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. It's not the first time someone's told me to stop talking, so I don't blame you. But yeah, no, it's so again, I would look to utilize the funds from the Clean Water Fund, which I've advocated for in the past, to help implement sewer lines where the residents want the sewer lines. I think that's important.
Ms. Zimmerman, 2 minutes.
Our waterways are one of the biggest attractions here in the 30th District, including Brookfield. We have families like myself that gravitate to the water and want to be able to enjoy it, and we, of course, anyone here wants to maintain it. This problem about sewerways and sewer systems and septic tanks is not just unique to Brookfield. I think we have to have a body of water caucus started in the state legislature, really tackle all of our bodies of water. Here in the 30th District, we have more than 50 bodies of water, and another town that's tackling a very similar conversation is Goshen with Woodridge Lake, and how they're going to pay for it is just the same conversation that's happening in Brookfield. We can learn a lot from each other in different towns to figure out how statewide we can relieve the burden on those few homes that feel like they're going to have to pay for it themselves when everyone's enjoying the water and everyone's enjoying the lake. I would like to see, again, with the surplus happening and, kind of reinventing the wheel of how we can use that surplus money and how we can use communities used up in our waterways.
Mr. Harding, 1 minute.
There's not much to add to that. I know Howard at the Craft Center has an interest in sewer lines being put down as well, and state funds, or town funds or ARPA funds being helped to allocate to address that. So again, I think it's utilizing our resources. We have a fund in the state of Connecticut, which is already existing revenue. We wouldn't have to tap into the surpluses that we have or the rainy day fund that we have to address a lot of these costs. Because again, we have a reoccurring expense in our budget related to clean water funds every year that we can tap into. Maybe for bigger projects, we can look at utilizing some of the surplus. But that's what
Ms. Zimmerman, 1 minute.
I'd like to add that when we're looking at expanding small businesses in our downtowns and looking to make sure that we have more entertainment close to bodies of water, that of course we have to make sure that our sewer systems are accessible. So I'll use the example of the coffee shop that used to be across from the craft center. It closed because it didn't have a sewer system, and unfortunately that's a business that was pulled out of our community, went to New Milford. It's still in the district, but they didn't want to move, they were forced to move. It would be lovely to see the opportunity to have those grants and have that money accessible immediately rather than delaying and having more red tape and bureaucracy when we're trying to have those small businesses stay here and we're trying to help our communities. Those community conversations obviously are happening now, but it doesn't seem like we have many legislators that are paying attention. So again, doubling down on having a water caucus. I know that we're not the only part of the state of Connecticut that has bodies of water that attract a lot of tourism and attract a lot of usage, and really tackling that head on. Lastly, I want to make sure that we have a conversation on invasive species and algae blooms. Thank you.
This is the Brookfield Chamber of Commerce debate, the candidates in the 30th State Senate District. What would you do to improve the roads in the district? Ms. Zimmerman, 2 minutes.
It's very exciting to see so much federal funding coming down the pipeline, but the question is it coming here? Oftentimes I've been told by other legislators that if you don't vote the right way or if you're not on board, you're not going to get money. So it's really pivotal to make sure that you have relationships in the state Senate to assure that money coming here and assure them that we're doing everything in our power to help the community. So that's conversation number one. Being a representative that listens, that has good communication, and is better advocating for not just one community, but everyone in the community. The infrastructure money is probably not going to be enough. That's realistic. I'd love to see real conversations of lockboxes being used. Right now, the state of Connecticut, right now, the budget is a general fund. So if you hear the word lockbox, it's not real. It doesn't happen. There's no lockbox for education. There's no lockbox for our roads. And I definitely don't want to hear the word tolls ever mentioned again. So let's have a real conversation of how we can have more spending here in infrastructure, use that federal money, and really put it in the places that we need.
Mr. Harding, 2 minutes.
So I would agree. I've always been against tolls from the beginning, and I continue to be against tolls. I don't think that's the proper way to address funding the transportation costs. It's an unbelievably regressive tax upon the individuals that many times could least afford it. They're just going back and forth to work and having to pay a toll. So I think that we have a unique opportunity with the infrastructure bill that was passed in Washington, D.C. to be able to tap into the federal funds to address that issue. And I think that's even more reason why we should be looking to repeal the highway usage tax, again, that I mentioned earlier in the debate, that would help address a lot of costs and help address inflation in a small way here in the state of Connecticut. Because we have the federal funds to tap into. I agree that we're going to have to put up our end as well. We're going to have to tap into some of our funds and potentially bond or even find some funds in our operating funds to address transportation infrastructure issues. But one thing I will say is that we've had a tendency in Hartford to pay for projects that we don't necessarily need, as opposed to addressing the critical needs in transportation that we have today and now. So we'll put up a busway from New Britain to Hartford, which is great, but is that more important than potentially fixing a bridge that is in desperate need of repair, or fixing other roads that are dangerous for drivers to ride on? So I think we just need to prioritize the projects in terms of what we address first and foremost with our funding, as opposed to investing in transportation projects that are more wants as opposed to critical needs we face it today.
Ms. Zimmerman, 1 minute.
Another fabulous way to make sure that we have infrastructure and our roads are wonderfully maintained and safe is making sure that we have employees to do it. So the Department of Transportation, as I mentioned earlier, there with the Department of Environmental Protection, we're talking about roads, we're talking about water. Who's going to fix them? Who's going to maintain them? Who's going to check our water? Who's going to, fix our roads? Well, if there's no employees, no one's going to do it. So we have to make sure that with that fiscal house being in order, we have more support with those state employees, that we're not spending so much money, literally wasting money outsourcing, when we can use the workers in-house to get that work done. In addition to that, those federal funds right now have to be allocated and have to be spent by, decided with the governor and with the legislature. And I can't reiterate even more how important it is to have those relationships with other legislators to make that happen, because we will be forgotten if we're not there and we don't have a seat at the table.
Mr. Harding, 1 minute.
Yeah, I would agree that it's important to have the relationship with fellow legislators. I've also been fortunate to be in the legislature for the past 7 years and to work with my colleagues. One of them is Representative Callahan here tonight, to address the local needs that address the 30th district as a whole. So I look forward, if I'm fortunate enough to be elected, to working with my colleagues who I've worked with the past 7 years in Hartford.
What is your position on a public health care option? Mr. Harding, 2 minutes.
I think it's something that we should be exploring. Healthcare costs in this state are skyrocketing. But I find that far too often, sometimes the solution regarding public healthcare options aren't necessarily the most successful towards addressing those healthcare costs. So I am certainly open to the idea of exploring different ways in which we can potentially implement the public healthcare option. As I mentioned, healthcare costs are one of the most critical aspects, and unfortunately for many families, the biggest bill they face in their homes. So it's certainly not something that I'm opposed to, but I think we need to be smart in how we craft it, because again, oftentimes when government gets involved in some of these markets, they often don't drive down the costs like they should be driving down. So if there's a solution that we can implement that would show that this option is going to drive down the healthcare costs for everybody in the state, and particularly those that need it the most, then I'm certainly willing to have a discussion about this.
Ms. Zimmerman, 2 minutes.
As someone who had a healthcare crisis in college, I can say that it's very, very heartening when you're left without anything and no options when you don't have healthcare. So we definitely have to fix it. As an assistant navigator of the state of Connecticut for 5 years, I heard similar gut-wrenching stories. Families who were on the brink of bankruptcy, families who decided they'd rather go without medicine, necessary medicine, and put their children through college, and put their life at their risk because they were prioritizing their families. And that definitely, again, should not happen. Realistic ways to tackle that. So right now we have Access Health CT, that's AKA Affordable Care Act, that was implemented. And we don't really fully fund it like we should. There's not an expansion in the program. The federal subsidies that were once there are no longer there, and the burden's on the state to make sure that it continues. Access Health also carries programs like Husky, so Medicaid, Medicare. When we're looking at federally, those different options of expansion, the public option, a lot of people don't understand that Connecticut is in a very beneficial situation. Other states, bigger states, they have multiple networks, and because of their multiple networks, they don't have the ability to have a one-stop shop. So here in Connecticut, because we're so small and we're the insurance capital of the world, we still are, we do have an easier way to navigate the public option and expand what technically is Husky C, Husky A, B, and expand it throughout the whole state and put more funding, so that way we have more people under the program, more people that are covered, that are not dependent on just private insurance, without putting so much burden on insurers. Right now, going back to Access Health Connecticut, when we started the program, you had 5 different vendors. Now you only have 2 to 3, it fluctuates each year. I'd love to put more pressure on the governor's administration to say, where are those insurance companies? Let's make sure that these plans are attractive for our small business owners, make sure it's attractive for people who need private insurance.
Mr. Harding, 1 minute.
I think just to expand on that, we were talking about healthcare costs in general, and the Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements rates in the state of Connecticut have historically been underfunded. Sometimes it's one of the first things that gets cut when we implement our budgets. And so what's doubly hurting about that is that when you implement a reduction in the Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement at the state level, the federal level then cuts that additional amount as well. So you're cutting it on both ends essentially when we fund our hospitals or our medical providers. So when you talk about utilizing some of the funds that we have in surplus, I think investing some of those funds in areas of Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement will help to make the healthcare cost more reasonable to be passed upon to the consumer as well. That's number one. Number two is I think it also addresses further access to care. I know Eva knows about this well. Both of us do regarding Sharon Hospital, and one of the things that has been discussed was some of the Medicaid, Medicare reimbursement rates being cut, and if those were fully funded, I think it would help address some of the costs and also help to provide further access for medical care and further options for individuals in the community.
Ms. Zimmerman, 1 minute.
I want to make sure that we don't repeat history and that we do fully fund Husky. And I remember back about 4 years ago where the legislature, there was a group of legislators that did want to cut Husky and didn't want to expand Husky. In addition to that, they cut Care for Kids, the child care subsidy, my opponent being one of them. So we should really take this seriously and make sure that we do fully fund Husky and child care.
What is your position on continuing the Affordable Appeals Housing Act? Ms. Zimmerman, 2 minutes.
I think we should expand the Affordable Appeals Housing Act. We should have regional appeals programs. For those who are not familiar with it, the state of Connecticut has housing committees and rent control committees, but only major cities get to take advantage of it. This past year, there was legislation that was introduced for towns that had 25,000 residents and more to have a housing committee or a rent control housing committee. And I think we should dig a little deeper. We should have committees that are fully funded, Affordable Appeals being one of them, and then have the opportunity to have community conversations and regional conversations to give more access for affordable housing. And just a clarification for those who might not know, affordable housing is workforce housing. It's not low-income housing, it's not Section 8. So a good example would be someone like my mother, after my parents' divorce. A little too much information, but I do want to make a point. After my mother divorced, she wanted to stay in our family home, but her kids were grown up and she couldn't afford it. So when she was looking for other options, she wanted to make sure that she wanted to stay close to her community, close to her grandkids, and through affordable housing programs for educators like herself, she was able to find a new home that was affordable for her and stay near her grandkids. So those are the kind of conversations we're trying to have. Housing conversations for EMT, housing conversations for people who are firefighters, teachers, who want to stay in this community and have the option to not battle it through with the government and get to stay here.
Mr. Harding, 2 minutes.
I think, you know, obviously affordable housing is a critical issue, and one of the things that I find frustrating with the 8-30G law is that when they do the calculation to determine what percentage of the housing stock is affordable, is that the senior housing is watered down essentially in the calculation. And I think that's wrong, because, you know, knocking on doors, meeting with individuals and serving this district for a number of years now. Senior housing and affordable housing for seniors is critically important, and when you have legislation at the state level, which essentially disincentivizes developers to implement senior affordable housing, I think that obviously is going to prohibit the development of that. You know, in terms of affordable housing in general, I think it's important to note that I believe that it can be done at a local level. Brookfield has been an example of that. We've had a moratorium now for 4 years on 8-30G, and we've developed more housing during that period of time. So I think that affordable housing should be something that should be developed at a local level, as opposed to statewide zoning laws, which you've seen many in Hartford advocate for, which I don't think is beneficial to the state of Connecticut. It would be something that I would oppose.
Ms. Zimmerman, 1 minute.
It's exciting to see Brookfield being a role model in this conversation, using Four Corners as an example of condos, mixed use, and why not go a little further, right? We have new buildings coming in, new condos coming in, and make sure that they also have affordable housing included in there. I think the conversation's already happening. It's just making the reinforcing of that conversation with funding and resources. Everything comes back down to the money, and I'm sure the local politicians here would like to hear how we can support them. Dipping into those different grants and opportunities through DCD and also CHIFA would be wonderful to see how we can support, further support Brookfield.
Mr. Harding, 1 minute.
In regards to just, you know, development, I think it's critically important that we also make sure that we don't overdevelop. I think that one of the things that the people in this community, and I know all across the 30th district, is the open space preservation that we have here. And I think what we've seen in the 30th, and I've heard from a lot of residents of the 30th, is that we've seen an incredible increase in overdevelopment. And I think we need to be smart and wise about how we develop our plans in Brookfield. I trust local officials to make those decisions.
The Brookfield Chamber of Commerce's debate the candidates in the 30th State Senate District. What is your evaluation of the Board of Regents of Higher Education? Mr. Harding, 2 minutes.
The Board of Regents is a system in which I think it's an additional level of bureaucracy. I don't know if it necessarily hinders or helps. I think that every college has their individual president who then reports to this additional Board of Regents. You know, I don't know if it's just a layer of bureaucracy we may just not need. I think in some respects they help to consolidate some of the ideas that the campus presidents may have and help to consolidate one plan. I think that's helpful. But to have the entire board and that additional level of bureaucracy and the taxpayers paying for it, I think you could maybe be able to help consolidate the Board of Regents to maybe a smaller group of executives in that group making that decision as opposed to an entire board. But again, I'm not opposed necessarily to the Board of Regents as it is already. It just seems like it is an extra layer of bureaucracy I don't know if we as a state necessarily need.
Ms. Zimmerman, 2 minutes.
I completely disagree. I think through the Board of Regents, with the previous, so Marco Jakian, through his leadership, consolidation did happen, but we had also the ability of clearing up some mismanagement, really looking at how we were tackling transportation for our students throughout the state of Connecticut, making sure that that consolidation wasn't happening in a silo and it was happening through every community in a thoughtful manner. One of the great things that with the Board of Regents, advocating and lobbying as well, was having free, colleges, community colleges, which is wonderful. Having that conversation in higher ed between our 4-year programs and our 2-year programs is extremely important, and being that vehicle of conversation between the higher ed community and the high school community, and then going through the legislature and the executive branch and the legislative branch is what they do. They tackle that head on. It's not easy to figure out what does curriculum look like when you're leaving high school, and how can you continue that? What do vocational programs look like? How do we have the ability to make sure that our youth stay here? And just a point of clarity, people think that our young people are leaving Connecticut in droves, and that's not the case. Connecticut right now ranks 8th in the nation for keeping young professionals and having new young professionals come here, and I would say the Board of Regents adds to that positive impact in our communities.
Mr. Harding, 1 minute.
I would say that I don't know if it's necessarily the Board of Regents that's the reason why we have an uptick in young professionals staying. I think there's probably a myriad of reasons why. And again, I think that the structure is questionable in how we structure the Board of Regents. I think there's individuals that are involved at the upper level that are overseeing all the colleges that are making good decisions in some respects. I do want to see, I think it's critically important that we keep our campuses open. I think there's been discussion about further consolidation of closing down some of the campuses in the northwest corner particularly. So one of the things that I fully support is ensuring that we keep all of our campuses open and not try to move on to a completely online in some areas, which that level of education I think is important, but being on campus and having a campus is critically important to our students as well.
Ms. Zimmerman, 1 minute.
That's a great conversation to have with the Board of Regents.
What do you see as the future of abortion access in Connecticut? We'll go to Ms. Zimmerman with 2 minutes.
Here, people assume that we're safe, that everything's fine, and that it's already been decided. My opponent, Representative Harding, voted against the reproductive health bill in this 2022 legislative session. And that means that here in Connecticut, it's not safe. We have a multitude of legislators that do not believe abortion should be a right and that reproductive health is not a priority, and it should be. Reproductive health is a continuum. It's not just abortions. We have programs in healthcare facilities that are treating LGBTQ, transitions for those who identify as trans. We have programs that make sure that contraception is accessible for our communities that don't have access to contraception. We have programs that give you different services like pap smears and also mammograms. That is reproductive health. A woman's right to choose a woman's body, that personal conversation of what they're going to do in an emergency or in a very difficult situation should be a conversation between them and their medical physician. And the state of Connecticut definitely should not have have access to that conversation. They should support it and make sure that healthcare is fully funded, make sure that healthcare is accessible to all of our communities.
Mr. Harding, 2 minutes.
The principles of Roe v. Wade that essentially protects a woman's right to choose up to viability, which is essentially about 24 weeks into the pregnancy or so, is codified in our state law. It was codified in our state law 30 years ago. I support its codification. I would never oppose the repeal of that law. The 2022 bill that my opponent references, what is a bill that had nothing to do with that 30-year codification of that law at all. The bill addressed some legal protections, which I did support, and I voted for an amendment to support those legal protections. But what the bill also did was expand individuals that were able to perform asphyxiation abortions, and the Connecticut State Medical Society, an organization which fully supports abortion rights, and even wrote that in a testimony they submitted to the committee, the Public Safety Committee, opposed that bill, because they were afraid of the safeguards that it might be delineated from the passage of that bill based upon the individuals that were now allowed to perform these abortions. So health standards for women that are seeking an abortion need to remain the same in the state of Connecticut, and that bill, in my opinion, diminished those health standards, and that's why I opposed them.
Ms. Zimmerman, 1 minute.
The final version of the bill where originally asphyxiation was proposed was eliminated, and that was not a factor in the final version of the bill. I think clarifying the history of the original bill and making sure that we remind ourselves that it was brought to the table and to the floor because of what was happening in Texas and the Roe versus Wade conversation, seeing it coming down the pipeline is very important. That's why legislators thought it was important to have the conversation early before Roe versus Wade was already overturned. Legislators debated on the floor with multitude of hours hours on how to fix it, how to make sure that they reach agreement, and an overwhelming majority voted in support of that bill. So if I was given the opportunity, to turn back time and be there at the floor, 100% I would support reproductive health, because it matters. It matters the stance that we take. It matters having those important conversations and come out really strong to support every version of reproductive health, including contraception.
Mr. Harding, 1 minute.
So again, the 24-week viability period is in statute and state law. I support it. And in terms of the abortions that were performed, the Connecticut State Medical Society still had concerns about the bill and the safety standards that were in the bill. And that's the reason I opposed it. But again, just to make my point clear, the law was codified, essentially codifying Roe v. Wade 30 years ago in the state of Connecticut. It's been law here for nearly 30 years, and I support that law.
What is your position on increasing charter school access in Connecticut? Mr. Harding, 2 minutes.
I believe it's a positive thing. I think providing, we talked about choice and providing parents a choice in determining where their students are educated. I think many individuals in certain communities throughout the state are limited in terms of where they're able to send their students and to send their children to schools. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with exploring options to expand access to charter schools for students and for parents that may see a better option for their students in charter schools. I think we need to be important and smart about how it's regulated and make sure that the schools are up to standards to protect the children and to educate the children well. But it's absolutely something that we shouldn't be opposed to blanketedly. I think that a lot of parents in many communities want to provide their children and their students at home more options of where they're able to educate their students. And I think in many respects, some charter schools provide that opportunity for them to. So to automatically shut that down as an idea is wrong. Again, it needs to be regulated, and we need to ensure that the schools and the charter schools that we're approving as a state are good, positive schools for the students to go to school in. But again, I think that it's something that we certainly need to be open-minded to, and I've always been open-minded to as a legislator in Hartford.
Ms. Zimmerman, 2 minutes.
I think comparing a woman's right to choose to comparing a parent's right to put a child into school is a little extreme there. But what I would say about charter schools in general, if a charter school had, statistics where it proved that our schools are better off, our students were better off, and that they were performing, fantastic in comparison to other states, then I'd strongly be for it. But unfortunately, that's not what it shows. Charter schools don't consistently prove that they're better than public schools. And then underfunding or pulling away that funding from public schooling because you want to fund a charter school is quite frightening, especially when we really depend on charter schools or public schools to not be charter schools, that they have regulation, that they have principles, that they're not run like a business, that they're making sure that their bottom line is not corporate, and that it's a student's education at the end of the day. So I am not in support of the version of charter schools that have been presented for the last 2 decades here in the state of Connecticut, and I will welcome to see what they might have in store in the future. But right now, I want to make sure that we support educators, our public teachers. Representative Harding's wife, who works at a public school, would be, in amazement if she can get more resources, more funding, making sure that we support her pension. Those are the kind of conversations that I want to have. My parents, my dad's a retired teacher, my mom's still in the school system. I want to be able to look at her in the face and say, Mom, I've got your back as a legislator because you dedicated your whole life. My dad dedicated his whole life to students to make sure that they were performing and giving every single student in their classroom an opportunity. And charter schools, they siphon off that funding.
Mr. Harding, 1 minute.
So I appreciate your thoughts for my wife and Kelly, and I certainly very much care about what she has to do for all the children in New Milford, and she's an amazing teacher, and I agree the public school teachers throughout the state and throughout this community deserve our full support and funding, and we could increase funding to our schools. In fact, the Democrat-led legislature and Governor Moy continue to try to cut funding to this very school that we're sitting in, time and time and time again. So we need to ensure that we provide proper ECS and maybe increased ECS funding to our local schools. But at the same time, we also shouldn't just shut the door completely on a charter school and say, tell a student that you have to go to this particular school because you just happen to live here if a parent wants another option for their student. I think that's unfair to that student.
Ms. Zimmerman, 1 minute.
I think that it connects also to the conversation of curriculum. So if parents, it's such a personal decision when you're looking at public policy, because charter schools are usually by theme or by type, right? So if the conversations at the electorate, the 30th district residents want their public funds, their tax-paying money to go to a charter school that is themed or a voucher program that has a religious aspect or of another kind of denomination, then we should hear and we should have that conversation. But I'm saying my personal opinion is seeing right now the statistics that the impact is not greater, it's not projecting better students. We have to concentrate on our public schools and make sure that we fully fund them.
Closing statements, Ms. Zimmerman, 4 minutes.
I've spent 16 years as an advocate. I've worked with nursing homes, hospital workers, childcare providers, paraprofessionals, school bus drivers. For me, being an advocate is not a hobby, it is not a career, it is a lifestyle. When I was very young, I was signed up by my parents to be a Jeff versus O'Neill plaintiff, and I didn't take it as seriously when I was that little, but as I got older, I understood why advocacy was one of the main pathway for change. And being in my 16th year now, behind the scenes, talking to people and listening to people, not just saying we're gonna find a solution or I'm gonna find a solution for you, but saying we're gonna do it together. That's what makes a difference. The 30th district needs someone who is compassionate, needs someone who is experienced at listening to really understand how to connect Fairfield County with Litchfield County. This district has 18 towns. It is not a normal district. It is the largest district in the state of Connecticut in land mass. So the problems of Brookfield are not the problems of Goshen, not always, well, the waterways are one of them, but the problems of Salisbury are not the problems of Torrington. And trying to mitigate all of those different factions of problems and then going to the state capitol and being the best advocate that you could is not an easy one. But it's something that I've been tethering in my career, my professional career, and my life, the way as I live as an advocate, year and year again. Going back to my introduction of that picture that I painted of my parents who came here from Puerto Rico, trying to find a better life, that immigrant's reality and having that American dream, which they found, is not the opportunity that we have for many people who live here, and we're not an immigrant, right? We want to have those opportunities for anyone who comes here. In the last 2 years, we've had 7,000 people move into the district, 7,000. Brookfield, in the last 20 years, have seen a 50% turnover in population. Brookfield then is not Brookfield now. And now we're competing. We're competing between what Brookfield wants to be and what Brookfield was. Why should we compete? Why not have the conversation and say, let's find middle ground. We all want to stay in this community. We love this community. Let's support this community. So hopefully with your support, my role could be to navigate that conversation, find the resources, and make sure that we have a beautiful, wonderful, green space, thriving economy here in the Brookfield and in the 30th district. Thank you.
Mr. Harding, 4 minutes.
Well, thank you again, Scott. Thank you to Eva for providing the opportunity as well and coming this evening. Thank you to all of you for coming tonight. And of course, thank you to the Chamber of Commerce once again. This is a great opportunity to hear from both of us and to hear ideas and what we can do for the town here in Brookfield, but as the 30th district as a whole. We hit on the points tonight, and I discussed it in my opening as well. I mean, I think the number one issue that we've heard from everybody is affordability in the state of Connecticut. When we're seeing inflation at record highs, when we're seeing the tax burden increase upon the residents of this state, we have to be cognizant of how we spend our state budget. What it comes down to is we have not been fiscally responsible over the past 30 years in the state of Connecticut. And the residents of the state of Connecticut are forced now to deal with those consequences. And so going forward, I think it's important that we have a representative in Hartford that understands the burden that tax increases and fee increases place upon the people in this state. I have seen far too many friends that I grew up with leave this community. I've seen far too many friends' parents leave this community because they can't afford to live here, particularly on a fixed income in their senior citizen years. The tax burden has increased in this state, and I've always opposed it, and I'll continue to oppose it. The public safety is critically important. We didn't get really a discussion too much about that tonight, but supporting our law enforcement and making sure that they have the resources available to them to protect all of us and to protect themselves is critically important. It's even more highlighted by the tragedy that occurred last week in Bristol. We have to ensure that we support our police. We have to ensure that we provide them the resources necessary to protect all of us and to protect themselves and do what they do best, the first responders in this community, particularly. Open space we discussed on a little bit. I think it's critically important that we continue to keep zoning laws and land use laws local. I see local land use and zoning officials and planning officials right here in this room tonight. You should be making the decision about what gets built and where it gets built in the town, not bureaucrats in Hartford. We've seen a continuous push in Hartford for statewide zoning. It's something that I'm continuously opposed to, and I'll always be opposed to. It leads to overdevelopment, and one of the beautiful things about the 30th District is the beautiful open space we have here. That needs to be protected. The last thing is just putting the community first. I have lived here my entire life, or nearly my entire life. I went through schools here, K through 12. I've lived in this district for 30 plus years. I think I know the residents of the district. They're my neighbors, they're my friends, they're my family members. And I've always put them first when making decisions. I'll always put them first when making decisions or fighting for funding for our area, and I'll never apologize for that. It would be the utmost honor, it's been the utmost honor to serve you as your state representative. It would be an unbelievable honor to continue to serve you as your state senator, so thank you so much.
Thanks to the candidates, Brookfield High School, producer Dan Secor, and the volunteers from the Brookfield Chamber of Commerce. I'm Scott Benjamin. Please be sure to vote on November 8th. Thanks for joining us.